There is no academic consensus on the most appropriate definition of the state. The term state refers to a set of different but interrelated and often overlapping theories about a certain range of political phenomena. The act of defining the term can be seen as part of an ideological conflict, because different definitions lead to different theories of state function, and as a result, validate different political strategies. According to Jeffrey and Painter, if we define the essence of the state in one place or era, we are liable to find that in another time or space, something which is also understood to be a state has different essential characteristics. Different definitions of the state often place an emphasis either on the means or the ends of states. Means-related definitions include those by Max Weber and Charles Tilly, both of whom define the state . Another commonly accepted definition of the state is the one given at the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of States in 1933. It provides that the state as a person of international law should possess the following qualifications: a permanent population, a defined territory, government, and capacity to enter into relations with the other states, and that the federal state shall constitute a sole person in the eyes of international law. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a state is an organized political community under one government, a commonwealth, a nation, or such a community forming part of a federal republic, especially the United States of America. Confounding the definition problem is that state and government are often used as synonyms in common conversation and even some academic discourse. According to this definition schema, the states are non-physical persons of international law, governments are organizations of people. The relationship between a government and its state is one of representation and authorized agency. Most political theories of the state can roughly be classified into two categories. The first are known as liberal or conservative theories, which treat capitalism as a given and then concentrate on the function of states in capitalist society. These theories tend to see the state as a neutral entity separated from society and the economies. Marxist and anarchist theories, on the other hand, see politics as intimately tied with economic relations and emphasize the relation between economic power and political power. They see the state as a person instrument that primarily serves the interests of the upper class. Marx and Engels were clear in the communist goal was classless society in which the state would have withered away, replaced only by administration of things. Their views are found throughout their collected works and address past or then extant state forms from an analytical and technical viewpoint, but not future social norms. Speculation, about which is generally antithetical to groups considering themselves Marxist, but who, not having conquered the existing state power, are not in the situation of supplying the institutional form of an actual society. To the extent that it makes sense, there is no single Marxist theory of state, but rather several different purportedly Marxist theories have been developed by adherents of Marxism. Marx's early writings portrayed the bourgeoisie state as parasitic, built upon the superstructure of the economy and working against the public interest. He also wrote that the state mirrors class relations in society in general, acting as regulator and repressor of class struggle, and as a tool of political power and domination for the ruling class. The Communist Manifesto claimed that the state to be nothing more than a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. For Marxist theorists, the role of the non-proletarian state is determined by its function in the global capitalist order. Ralph Miliband argued that the ruling class uses the state as its instrument to dominate society by virtue of the interpersonal ties between state officials and economic elites. For Miliband, the state is dominated by an elite that comes from the same background as the capitalist class. State officials therefore share the same interests as owners of capital and are linked to them through a wide array of social, economic, and political ties. Gramsci's theories of state emphasize that the state is only one of the institutions in society that helps maintain the hegemony of the ruling class, and that state power is bolstered by the ideological domination of the institutions of civil society, such as churches, schools, and mass media. Pluralists view society as a collection of individuals and groups who are competing for political power. They then view the state as a neutral body that simply enacts the will of whichever groups dominate the electoral process. Within the pluralist tradition, Robert Dow developed the theory of the state as a neutral arena for contending interests and its agencies as simply another set of interest groups. With power competitively arrayed in society, state policy is a product of recurrent bargaining. Although pluralism recognizes the existence of inequality, It asserts that all groups have an opportunity to pressure the state. The pluralist approach suggests that the modern democratic state actions are the result of pressures applied by a variety of organized interests. Thou call this kind of state a polyarchy. Pluralism has been challenged on the ground that it is not supported by empirical evidence, citing surveys showing that the large majority of people in high leadership positions are members of the wealthy upper class. Critics of pluralism claim that the state serves the interests of the upper class rather than equitably serving the interests of all social groups. Contemporary political thinker Habermas believed that the base superstructure framework used by many Marxist theorists to describe the relation between the state and the economy was overly simplistic. He felt that the modern state plays a large role in structuring the economy by regulating economic activity and being a large-scale economic consumer producer. And through its redistributive welfare state activities, because of the way these activities structure the economic framework, Habermas felt that the state cannot be looked as a passively responding to economic class interests. Michel Foucault believed that modern political theory was too state-centric, saying maybe, after all, the state is no more than a composite reality and a mythologicalized abstraction, whose importance is a lot more limited than many of us think. He thought that political theory was focusing too much on abstract institutions and not enough on the actual practices of government. In Foucault's opinion, the state had no essence. He believed that instead of trying to understand the activities of governments by analyzing the properties of the state as a ratified abstraction, political theorists should be examining changes in the practice of government to understand changes in the nature of the state. Foucault argues that it is technology that has created and made the state so elusive and successful, and that instead of looking at the state as something to be toppled, we should look at the state as technological manifestation or system with many heads. Foucault argues instead of something to be overthrown as in the sense of the Marxist and anarchist understanding of the state. Every single scientific technological advance has come to the surface of the state, Foucault argues, and it is with the emergence of the mathematical sciences and essentially the formation of mathematical statistics that one gets understanding of the complex technology of producing how modern state was so successfully created. Foucault insists that the nation-state was not a historical accident, but a deliberate production in which the modern state had to now manage coincidentally with the emerging practice of police, allowing the population to now come in to Eustantium and civitas after deliberately being excluded for several millennia. Democracy wasn't, as is always, painted by both political revolutionaries and political philosophers as a cry for political freedom or wanting to be accepted by the ruling elite. Foucault insists, but was a part of a skewed endeavor of switching over new technology, such as pulitudo, politesis, and extra ecclesiam nulla salus readily available from the past medieval period, into mass persuasion for the future industrial political population, in which the political population was now asked to insist upon itself the president must be elected. Were these political symbols agents represented by the Pope and the president are now democratized. Foucault calls these new forms of technology biopower and form part of our political inheritance, which he calls biopolitics. Heavily influenced by Gramsci, the capitalist states do not always act on behalf of the ruling class, and when they do, it is not necessarily the case because state officials consciously strive to do so, but because the structural position of the state is configured in such a way to ensure that the long-term interests of capital are always dominant. Poulence's main contribution to the Marxist literature on the state was the concept of relative autonomy of the state. While Poulence's work on state autonomy has served to sharpen and specify a great deal of Marxist literature on the state, his own framework came under criticism for its structural functionalism. States generally rely on a claim to some form of political legitimacy in order to maintain domination over their subjects. The rise of the modern-day state system was closely related to the changes in political thought, especially concerning the changing understanding of legitimate state power and control. Early modern defenders of absolutism, such as Thomas Hobbes and Schomburgk, undermined the doctrine of the divine right of kings by arguing that the power of kings should be justified by reference to the people. Hobbes in particularly went further to argue that political power should be justified with reference to the individual, not just to the people understood collectively. Both Hobbes and Bowden thought they were defending the power of kings, not advocating for democracy, but their arguments about the nature of sovereignty were fiercely resisted by some traditional defenders of the power of kings, who thought that such defenses ultimately opened the way to more democratic claims. Max Weber identifies three main causes of political legitimacy in his works. The first, legitimacy based on traditional grounds, is derived from a belief that things should be as they have been in the past, and that those who defend these traditions have a legitimate claim to power. The second, legitimacy based on charismatic leadership, is devotion to a leader or group that is viewed as exceptionally heroic or virtuous. The third is rational legal authority, whereby legitimacy is derived from the belief that a certain group has been placed in power in a legal manner, and that their actions are justifiable according to a specific code of written laws. Weber believed that the modern state is characterized primarily by appeals to rational legal authority. There are long-standing debates within international relations between proponents of different theoretical approaches to this subject. While theoretical debates can seem disconnected from the reality on the ground that motivates many health policy actors, they offer an important means of analyzing global health and how globalization affects health. If we are driven by a desire to improve health, it is crucial to diagnose the precise nature of the problem that confronts us. Different theories offer competing accounts of the problem we face, presenting equally different solutions to these problems. As such, the theoretical lens through which we examine health determines both the way we understand global health and the way we engage with concrete political issues in this context. Anarchism is a political philosophy which considers the state immoral, unnecessary, and harmful, and instead promotes a stateless society. Anarchists believe that the state is inherently an instrument
of domination and repression, no matter who is in control of it. Anarchists note that the state possesses the monopoly on the legal use of violence. The concept of anarchy refers to the absence of an overarching global authority to govern the relationship between states in the same way that the state acts as the ultimate authority governing the relations between individuals in the domestic sphere. This is of vital importance to debates in global health policy, as the types of policy solution that may be feasible in the domestic sphere under state governments may not be possible at the global level. Thus, new forms of governance arrangement are needed that seek to coordinate the state behavior and aim to foster cooperation between states in different forms. Realist scholars assume that states are the principal, if not only, actors in the international sphere. States, in turn, are concerned primarily with their survival and security, and the role of state leaders is to pursue policies that will guarantee this. States must rely on themselves to guarantee their security. International institutions are unable to provide the guarantee of security that states require. Realists place great emphasis on the concept of state sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention. These refer to the ability of states to govern their internal affairs free from interference by other states. Realist scholars therefore criticize the right of WHO as an international organization to intervene in the internal affairs of a state, as well as the effectiveness of these organizations in regulating interstate relations. Neoliberalists suggest collaboration between states in international institutions. Given the concern of liberal theory with the individual, neoliberalism focuses on what is termed human security rather than simply state security. Human security focuses on the safety and well-being of individuals within states rather than the security and survival of the states they inhabit. Universal human rights and the doctrine of collective security, which places the responsibility for guaranteeing these rights on the international community, acting under the auspices of international organizations such as the United Nations. Liberal values, informed by conceptions of a universal right to health, underpin much of the policy agenda in global health. The concept of human security, for example, focuses not only on the threat to individuals from war or oppression by their governments, but has broadened out to include a multitude of other factors such as poverty, disease, and environmental degradation that affect the livelihood and well-being of millions of people across the planet. From a liberal perspective, the HIV and AIDS epidemic, for example, has been considered a security issue and a matter of concern for the international community. For realists, meanwhile, this would be seen as an internal issue for the states in question and the responsibility of those state governments to intervene as they see fit. In the field of international political economy, neoliberalism is premised on a belief in the benefits of free trade and the positive effects this can have economically and politically. Economically, states benefit through the greater specialization and the more efficient allocation of resources brought about through international trade, and politically through greater interconnectedness between states as trading partners, which lessens the possibility of conflict between them. What underlies constructivist approaches is an emphasis on the need to view events and processes in their context and to explain them in terms of meaning and identity. Constructivists look into account for the specific historical conditions that led to a given event. They often attempt to trace the emergence of politically salient issues or the particular terms that structure political debates. This may involve, for example, problematizing and expanding the concept of security or human rights present in global health debates, or examining why some issues enter the political agenda while others do not. Critical approaches share a common set of aims and objectives. If mainstream approaches look to describe and explain the world, critical approaches look to change it. They examine the exploitative nature of the international system with the goal of ideal equality and justice for the entire world's people, regardless of nationality or geography, and an end to exploitation of the poor by the wealthy and powerful. They look into the unequal access to medicines or clean drinking water for people in certain parts of the world, or on the role of economic globalization in preventing this. Equally, a broader question surrounds the connection between health and poverty and the consequences for health of massive economic inequality between the global south and the global north. Critical international relations theory offers important insights into the global south, the structural characteristics of the international system, and the economic relations that pertain between states are key determinants of health in low and middle income countries. While some actors focus on issues such as aid and debt relief, critical scholars call for a fundamental reconfiguration of the international economic, trade, and political systems to remove the structural impediments to health in large swaths of the world. Feminist approaches to international relations examine issues of gender in an international context. This may focus on particular conceptions of human security, for example, on the specific experience of women in conflict situations in which they may be the victim of systematic rape or face additional dangers and challenges as the primary carers of children. Alternatively, feminist approaches may look more abstractly at the particular forms of male domination or patriarchy, which structure the conduct and conceptualization of international politics. The relevance of feminist approaches can be found in maternal and reproductive health, as well as specialist pediatric service. Post-colonialism examines issues related to the developing world as consequence of colonialism, and the position occupied by former colonies and their inhabitants since the process of decolonialization began in the early to mid-20th century. Many scholars working within this tradition highlight new forms of colonialization that have emerged within the global economy as a result of the relationship of dependence that exists between the former colonies in the developing world and governments and cooperation in developed countries. Processes of globalization have impacted on the state as a political actor both domestically and in the international domain. First, globalization has led to the emergence of new types of global policy and regulatory issues that require global solutions. Examples of these include the regulation of cross-border trade or currency flows, or the health challenges posed by the large-scale movement of people across the globe that may facilitate or accelerate the spread of infectious diseases. Second, changes in the structure of the global economy have led to an erosion of the political power of states to regulate transnational economic activity. The inability of states to act unilaterally to police the activities of corporations, for example, or to halt the spread of infectious diseases and environmental degradation, undermines their de facto control or sovereignty over several policy issues. Questions arise about whether the state is able to respond to the challenges presented by globalization and reassert its control over these issues through new governance structures such as international organizations. At the same time, it has been argued that these forms of governance themselves undermine rather than augment the power of the state. The following section examines in more detail the responses of the state to the challenges posed by globalization. Here we will examine both bilateral and multilateral solutions to the problem of governance in a globalizing world. While multilateral solutions may involve formation of international organizations, the bilateral will be focused on two countries. In terms of responses to globalizations, states have attempted to respond to the challenges through participation of international organizations. So, to what extent international organizations enhance or undermine the power of the states? States as full members may retain a strong input into the decision-making structures of international organizations. However, not all states have equal political input into these decision-making processes. Bilateral relationship is actually the relationship, both formal and informal, between two states. This may be in the forms of officially codified and legally enforceable trade agreements or looser forms of engagements. Bilateral relationships are often associated with the financing of particular health programs in developing world countries. For example, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, funded by the US government, established funding for a range of HIV-related programs in low-income countries. Bilateral programs serve as a means through which donors can exercise direct control over how each funds are allocated and applied, and also allow funders to promote particular forms of intervention that are in keeping with the underlying ideology of the funder. Elements of the programs funded by PEPFAR have been criticized on these grounds. Bilateral agreements are becoming increasingly common in the field of international trade. As Doha round of WTO negotiations stalled in early 2000s, states began to negotiate an increasing number of bilateral and regional trade agreements with one another. These agreements have particular consequences for global health. It has been argued that these agreements prioritize trade over health. As we said, international organizations can be seen as a means through which states have attempted to respond to the undermining of their capacity for effective unilateral action and the increasing interdependence between states. International organizations of this type are considered to be multilateral actors as they bring together large numbers of states in a single forum. Examples of such organizations include the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and its sister organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the G8, the G20, and the European Union. A central question in international relations that is of great importance for our understanding of global health is to what extent international organizations enhance or undermine the power of the state. On one hand, states retain a strong input into the decision-making structures of international organizations, whereas other organizations may be officially recognized by international organizations or may have observer status. States are full members and are at the heart of the decision-making processes of these organizations. On the other hand, however, not all states have equal political input into these decision-making processes. So some states may retain a high level of control over policies decided within an international organization, while smaller, poorer states may have little de facto input. Similarly, states do not retain complete control over the organizations they create. The Secretariat and officials of international organizations may be able to exert considerable influence over the direction and content of the measures adopted within their institutions. The extent to which they retain control varies between institutions. While most international organizations remain overwhelmingly intergovernmental in nature, depending on the member states for their ultimate authority, and guided in the substance of their position by the most powerful members. Other international organizations, such as the European Union, have a more robust and influential supranational component in the form of the European Commission. The Commission exercises considerable influence over EU legislation through its right to propose and draft laws that are ratified by the European Parliament and the Member States in the body known as the Council. In 2010, the European Commission urged a stronger common European voice in the international health policy. The High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy was then formed. The development of a common foreign policy does not imply that national foreign policies are withering away. The EU is a union of member states, but each policy area is characterized by its distinction between union and member states. And individual member states may obstruct common policies and decisions in different policy areas. The configuration of involved institutions, their roles, and their policy and decision-making processes vary across policy areas. And it matters whether a policy is primarily internal or external. To complicate matters, this configuration changes over time, and change is sometimes triggered by formal treaty reform processes, and at other times by social or institutional learning. The EU's portfolio of international policies, which means policies aimed at changing the state of affairs outside the EU, has expanded considerably over time. Health policy has been one of the more recent additions to these policies. In several policy areas, such as trade and development, the EU is a relatively experienced player. In other policy areas, such as territorial defense, the EU is hardly a player at all. In between these two options, there is a mixed zone of arrangements. When examining the EU's international policies, it is useful to consider the origin of international policies. The rationale for some of the international policies is that they represent the international dimension of domestic EU policies.
The International Health Regulation is the only set of international legal rules binding on WHO member states concerning the control of infectious diseases. The IHR formally began life in 1951 as the International Sanitary Regulations, to consolidate the patchwork of international sanitary conventions in effect prior to the World War II into one set of universally applicable rules. This consolidation and harmonization effort did not involve moving the regime away from its basic substantive structure, which means that the governance approach developed before WHO creation formed the basis for the international sanitary regulations. WHO changed the name from the International Sanitary Regulations to the IHR in the late 1960s. The IHR are binding rules of international law created by WHO member states. Although these rules are called regulations, the moniker does not affect the status as a treaty under international law. The process through which WHO member states adopted IHR differs from the normal process of concluding treaties. The IHR
The international health regulation failed comprehensively to achieve the objective of maximum security against international disease spread with minimum interference with world traffic. The WHO member states routinely violated the IHR obligations to report outbreaks of diseases subject to the regulations. A leading reason for such massive non-compliance with notification duties was that WHO member states did not report outbreaks for fear of economic cost they would suffer when countries learned of and reacted to the outbreaks. This reason was actually unsung because they are protected by the IHR's rules on trade and travel measures. No matter what, the IHR imploded as the member states ignored their international legal obligations under the IHR. In a few times in history, the IHR simply became irrelevant to infectious disease control. The IHR's focus on what were called the pestilential diseases of the past increasingly made this classical regime irrelevant to more pressing global infectious disease problems. As a governance matter, the IHR were irrelevant to attempts to address diseases not subject to the IHR. The IHR also became increasingly irrelevant to the way in which WHO's work on infectious diseases had developed since its creation. It has been commented that the international health cooperation has moved away from the at-the-border controls to meeting diseases at their sources. With scientific and technology development, WHO added eliminating communicable disease at their sources to its mandate of containing spread through its more traditional functions of coordinating international health regulations and serving as an information clearinghouse. WHO's desire to attack infectious diseases at their sources within countries represented a vertical public health strategy rather than a horizontal one. Vertical strategies seek to reduce infectious disease prevalence within states. Vertical strategies are not primarily interested in cross-border microbial traffic, which is the raison d'etre of the classical regime on infectious disease control. Reducing infectious disease prevalence inside countries would help reduce cross-border microbial traffic as the likelihood of disease exportation is reduced. It has been criticism that the international sanitary conventions as superfluous and urged nations to control and eliminate epidemic diseases inside their own borders. WHO's growing interest in vertical as opposed to horizontal public health strategies extended beyond its activities on eradicating diseases at their sources. WHO's main strategic focus during its 50-plus years has been trying to improve public health in developing countries. WHO's work with developing countries predominantly involved vertical public health strategies because WHO was more interested in improving public health conditions within poor countries than in managing the public health consequences of mechanistic state interaction for the primary benefit of great powers. There is a new type of interaction between governments and WHO. National health authorities provide most of the control of diseases at their sources. But for developing countries without the capacity or resources to control communicable diseases, the WHO helped to do so, funded by industrial countries. In this shift, humanitarianism replaced the fear and economic concerns of the great powers as the driving force of international health activities.